All right, welcome back, Academic Astronomy, for our final lecture of the school year. This is the third and final part to Section 8, Search for Extraterrestrial Life. Coming back at you from my back porch again, it's Mr. Krug. I guess let's take a moment of silence to think about all the good times that we had this year. Now, sadly, it's coming to an end. All right, I'm good. Let's do this. So where we left off last time, we were on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And we left off with probably the most famous extraterrestrial story of all time, the alleged crash of an object at Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. So we're going to stay in the Western United States for our first case this time. And this is our final third kind encounter that we're going to talk about. And this is generally considered one of the most credible third kind encounters in all of history. Remember, close encounter of the third kind, either of the first two sightings, but you supposedly see occupants of the craft itself. So this happened near Socorro, New Mexico, which incidentally was also the site of some nuclear testing by the United States. And so this entire area in the Southwest ended up being a hotbed for UFO sightings for many years. Some people believe the military was simply testing experimental aircraft. Others believe that us detonating nuclear weapons aroused the suspicions of other civilizations because they had no idea we had come along so quickly in terms of nuclear power, and they came to investigate themselves. So this was the Officer Lonnie Zamora sighting. One very hot afternoon outside of Socorro, Zamora was on patrol by himself, and he heard an explosion over the hill in front of him, which initially he assumed was an old dynamite shack left there by a mining company that had simply exploded due to the heat. But upon cresting the hill in his squad car, he looked down the other side and saw what initially he thought was a silver broken down automobile by the side of the road and two children standing beside it. But upon creeping slightly closer with his squad car, he noticed to his shock, this was no automobile. It appeared to be an egg-shaped spaceship with three skinny landing legs on the ground. And these didn't appear to be actual children, but two extraterrestrials in silver flight suits. Zamora even described seeing what appeared to be red hieroglyphic writing on the outside of the capsule. Remember that because we mentioned something similar with the Kecksburg UFO crash in our last lecture. The two beings see Zamora, quickly jump into their ship, the stairs retract, the legs fold up, and it takes off with an explosion, which sets some nearby brush on fire. Now, thinking quickly, because a lot of UFO eyewitnesses never do this, Zamora went back to his car where he had a camera and he had a ruler for measurements. He quickly measured and photographed the three circular landing depressions. I always find it hilarious that no matter how advanced these UFOs are, they all seem to have three circular landing legs or feet that are always in a triangle shape, which is funny to me. So he photographs them. He also photographs the burning brush that it set on fire. And this actually remains one of the more credible UFO sightings in history. Not only are police officers generally considered very credible observers due to their line of work, but Zamora collected evidence right away. Okay, so fourth kind encounters are probably not for the faint of heart. And here's where things get rather controversial. A close encounter of the fourth kind is human contact in transit with life forms. Remember, this is the first of the 4 levels that were added decades after J. Allen Hynek, due to the diversity of UFO and alien phenomenon people were reporting. So, for example, I'm sure you've all heard of the Steven Spielberg classic, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. That came out when there were only 3 levels. So it now goes up to 7. So fourth kind encounters are the so-called alien abduction scenarios. Now, according to some, upwards of thousands of people every single night around the earth are getting taken out of their bedrooms or out of stalled out cars beside the road, whisked aboard a UFO where medical experiments are done, biological samples are taken, And then they're plopped right back into their bed, right into their car, and their memories are entirely wiped, so they forget the entire thing. And yet, despite this, and despite everybody having a smartphone today, there is still not one credible piece of actual good footage of an alien abduction taking place. And so here people think this phenomenon could be a lot of different things. Some people think that witnesses who report it are just having very vivid dreams at night that they're mistaking for reality. Others believe that these are actually a real abduction. One time I got to present with a fairly well-known UFO researcher. He is a tenured professor at Harvard, Dr. David Jacobs, and he has spent 20 to 30 years with what's called regression hypnosis of these eyewitnesses. Some believe there's a part of your brain that's just a permanent memory recorder, and it's recording every second of every day of your existence, whether you're conscious or not. And through regression hypnosis, we are actually able to tap into that part of the brain. But we have to be careful because even today, we don't entirely understand how hypnosis works. And if a hypnotist asks a witness something that's leading in the way he or she asks it, it can actually cause those people to remember things that did not actually happen. So there's that element. Still, others think the abductions are real, but it's actually a multi-dimensional aspect. There have been people knocked out cold, muttering through an abduction experience. Their friends can't wake them up, but once they finally come to, they swear they were on board a spaceship. So is it a vivid dream, or is this happening at a higher dimensional level? There's a great diversity of stories, and this is why it's so controversial. So we're not going to talk about a lot of cases, but it is very fascinating how consistent a lot of these tales are. Now, we are going to cover probably the most famous alien abduction in modern history. It's been the subject of countless movies and documentaries. This is the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill. Now, for starters, take a good look at Betty and Barney. Probably not what you would think when you hear the term alien abductees. Skeptics would like to convince you that anybody who reports an alien abduction is either drunk, on drugs, looking for fame, looking for money. And for most of these people, that could not be further from the truth. In fact, a lot of abductees end up exhibiting symptoms very similar to physical or mental abuse. So take a look at Betty and Barney. They were happily married their entire life. Barney had a steady job. Betty was a career homemaker. They never had any trouble with the law. About the only unique thing about Betty and Barney is they were a mixed race couple, which for the early 1960s was fairly progressive. But otherwise, they were just a regular, everyday American couple. So here is what happened with their story. One night, they were driving back through southern Canada to their home in New Hampshire on a road that they had traveled frequently. They had had a very nice weekend trip and were just returning home when they happened to be on a long, straight stretch of road where there was no other traffic. It was nighttime. Ahead in the sky, they saw a bright light, which initially they assumed was the planet Venus. Very good assumption. Venus is the natural object in the night sky most often mistaken for a UFO. But upon driving farther, they could see that the object appeared to be going in the same direction as them. So they then logically assumed it was simply an airplane. Finally, though, Barney's curiosity gets the better of him, and he pulls the car to the side of the road. He reaches into the glove box, gets out a pair of binoculars that he had, and he heads out of the car to take a look at this object. Upon peering in the sky, to his shock, he sees a spaceship with a row of windows on it and black silhouettes in each of the windows. He screams to Betty, "Start the car, they're coming to get us." Barney jumps into the car, and they both recalled hearing a beeping sound, not unlike a microwave oven, and they just blanked out. When they came to, their car was farther down the road than they remembered it being. By the time they got home, they saw their trip had taken 2 hours longer than it normally did. On their way into the house, they noticed the paint on the hood of the car had been peeled off, like there was a heat source very, very close to it. They had weird aches and pains all over their body, and they had a series of nightmares over the next few weeks. So finally, a friend convinced them to both go to a hypnotist to try to uncover this missing time. So here's what Betty and Barney both said under hypnosis about their interrupted journey. The craft landed very close to them, and beings which were clearly not humans came out and ushered them onto the ship. They were taken into separate rooms where medical examinations were done. Apparently, Barney gave them quite a start when he removed his teeth, because he had false teeth. And then they were reunited in the main room and about to be led off the ship. Now, probably at this point, it sounds exactly like any other alien abduction story that you've ever heard. Here's what makes this story rather unique, though. As they were about to be led off the ship, Betty and Barney claimed to see a book on board, and they asked the leader if they could have the book as evidence that they'd been there. But the other beings on board apparently said, no, if you give them that, people will know that we are real. So apparently, as somewhat of a consolation prize, they flashed up a three-dimensional star map inside the craft. And you can see a drawing of it right here. It supposedly showed our own star Sol and the double star system from where the beings came. These lines then were allegedly trade routes that the extraterrestrials had with other star systems. So afterwards, with the help of her amateur astronomy friend, Marjorie Fish, who, by the way, graduated from nearby Juniata College and just passed away last year, Betty was able to recreate this star map. Now, here's both sides of the story. Skeptics, like the famed astronomer Carl Sagan, jumped on this, and they basically said, you know what? There are so many stars in the sky, you could basically make any pattern of dots you wanted, and it would line up somewhere. But then believers were able to match this map up with a star system in the southern hemisphere, which some of us are going to plot on our SCP charts next week, called Zeta Reticuli. So Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, Epsilon, Zeta. That's the sixth brightest star in the constellation Reticulum, which is only visible in the southern hemisphere. Here's what's unique about it. It's a double star system, and both stars comprise a wide binary, meaning they travel beside each other through outer space instead of orbiting around each other. They're both like our own sun, except older, so in theory, it might give another civilization more time to evolve and develop. And what's really curious about it is Betty is able to describe this star system in great detail a full 6 years before astronomers actually knew the full reality of it, that it truly was a double star system and what the stars were like. So isn't it fascinating that a woman with no scientific or astronomy background is able to describe a star system a good 6 years before astronomers even discovered it? I always keep my eye on the Zeta Reticuli star system, and back in the early 2000s, a team of astronomers announced that they had found planets orbiting one of the stars, but then they retracted their findings the very same day. Now, sometimes in science, retractions do happen, but I've never seen one happen the same day that it was made. So, is there a chance that Betty and Barney were actually telling the truth about a real account that happened? They passed multiple lie detector tests and held to this story to their dying day, and it remains one of the most credible accounts in history of a so-called alien abduction. Another one that was made into a movie, the movie is called Fire in the Sky, but this witness later regretted signing off his rights because the movie interpretation was very different than the real event. This was the abduction of a 19-year-old Arizona lumberjack named Travis Walton. Even more surprising is that the abduction happened in full view of 5 of his co-workers. Here's how the story went down. In 1975, the team was logging late into the night outside of a little town called Snowflake, Arizona. They were behind on their contract and working overtime. They all piled into one man's extended cab pickup truck, all 6 of them, and they bounded down these logging roads to head home. Ahead of them, they saw the sky lit up bright red over a hill, and they assumed they were about to drive into a forest fire. To their shock, though, upon cresting the hill, they could see a UFO hovering in the clearing above the sky. Against the better wishes of the 5 men with him, Travis jumped out, ran into the middle of the clearing, and stared up at the UFO, which was now glowing blue. All of a sudden, without warning, it shot a bright beam of light down, hitting Travis in the chest and knocking him back into the underbrush. The other 5 men panicked and fled the other way in the pickup truck into the night. A few minutes later down the road, they came to their senses. They said, we're such cowards, we have to go back and we have to get Travis. He's a kid, he's only 19. They headed back to the clearing, and both the UFO and Travis were gone. They searched with flashlights everywhere in the underbrush, and there was no sign of him. Heading back into town, they immediately went right to the sheriff's station. Initially, the police assumed that the other men had murdered Travis and concocted the whole ridiculous story about an alien abduction. Yet all 5 men told the same story and passed lie detector tests, yet still no Travis. 3 days passed, and finally Travis's mother gets a collect phone call from a phone booth outside of town. It's Travis. He's totally naked, nobody knows where his clothes went, and he had 3 days of stubble on his face. He was taken in and nursed back to health, and here's the story he told about that missing time. He awoke in a small room that he remarked seemed similar to an interrogation room that police would use. 3 beings in red flight suits then came into the room, and they were clearly not human. Thinking quickly, he picked up what looked like a small pipe in the room and held it above him in a menacing fashion, and the beings fled. Gathering up his strength, Travis tried to pursue them and found himself in a long circular hallway. He went off the hallway into the interior and found what looked like the bridge of a ship, with a domed ceiling, not unlike our planetarium. Seeing a control panel, he cautiously put his hands over the control panel, and as soon as he did, the entire dome lit up in a star field. He found that by moving his hands around the panel, it would change the orientation of the field, making him dizzy. He pulled his hands back, and the whole dome went dark. Re-entering the circular hallway, he then took a door out the other way, and to his shock, found himself in a large hangar of an even bigger ship, where his ship and other circular crafts were parked in a row. He wandered across the hangar into a room on the other side, a laboratory, where he reported that very human scientists were working. He tried to talk to them in English and explain his plight, but none of the other men wanted to listen to him. Then he reported that a large muscular man with long blonde hair came in and shouted in very clear English, "Hey, what are you doing in here? You're not supposed to be awake." He grabbed Travis in a bear hug. Travis passed out, and when he came to, he was outside of this phone booth outside of town. So Travis is still alive, and he continues to tell his story. I got to hear him speak about 2 years ago, and even to this day, going through the account is very difficult on him to tell the full details of the story. Both he and the 5 other men have passed lie detector tests ever since, and this remains a fairly credible account, many believe, of an alien abduction. Okay, let's take a break and let's go ahead and ask some of the questions that are going to appear in Google Classroom. So we're going to do these just like we did the last time we did a third lecture. We're just going to do 3 of them right now. So question number 21. Contact and transit with extraterrestrial life forms is one of the most controversial aspects of modern ufology, and these are usually dubbed alien blank. Question number 21. Feel free to pause the video and answer the question. Question 22. With the help of amateur astronomy friend Marjorie Fish, Betty Hill constructed a star map that some researchers now identify with the blank blank star system found in the southern hemisphere. Question number 22. And question number 23. One of the most famous alien abduction accounts, 5 eyewitnesses saw this man hit by a bright beam of light shot from a hovering UFO, and they have all passed countless lie detector tests ever since. Question number 23. All right, everybody, great job so far. Let's go ahead and get back into the action. So we're next going to talk about famous examples of fifth kind encounters. Now, the clarifier here is intentional, mutual, or consistent contact. Probably if Steven Spielberg's movie would be remade today, it would likely be called Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, because the premise of the movie is that the United States government contacts an extraterrestrial civilization, and they eventually arrange for a rendezvous, a meeting, where personnel are exchanged. So some people believe if this is actually happening, there is no place greater than Area 51, Nevada. So here's the backstory about what we know for sure. Wanting more secrecy for their government contracts and their aircraft testing, Lockheed Martin needed a new facility because the area around their Skunk Works facility at Bakersfield, California, was becoming too populated. It was too difficult to actually do classified tests there. So the government owned about 3 million acres of dry, desolate land in western Nevada. And so they picked grid number 51 of the Nellis Air Force Test Range, parts of which the United States used for nuclear weapons testing. And they built a facility on a dry lake bed there called Groom Lake. So it's had many slang names over the years, but the one that really sticks is called Area 51. It's also been known as Dreamland or Rainbow Ranch, but most people today identify it as Area 51. It's incredibly high stakes. The government is legally permitted to use deadly force if you trespass onto the property, meaning it's so high stakes and classified, they could actually kill you if you went onto the land. But fear not, you always get caught well before you get even close, because around the entire perimeter, they have motion sensors, they have vibrational sensors. The area is patrolled from the air, so if you even get close to the boundary, they already have a private security force waiting there for you to escort you off the property if you get close. Further, within the last 25 years, they have closed off all the scenic overlooks, which are even close to Area 51. The closest you can actually get to it now is about 25 miles away from the base. Now, we know for a fact from listening to accounts of people who have worked there, the government tests incredible terrestrial aircrafts, like the SR-71 Blackbird, U-2 spy planes, the stealth fighter, the stealth bomber, some of the Soviet MiGs during the Korean War were brought here to be tested. And so we know that part happens. Where Area 51 becomes controversial is some supposed former employees, like this man called Bob Lazar, who also provided some very credible documentation that he worked there, was that the military is also working on reverse engineering extraterrestrial craft, meaning that a UFO would crash somewhere and they would bring it to either Area 51 or Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. And these scientists would take it apart to try to figure out how it actually worked. And so we know that there is some very exotic technology there, but is it just human-made or is it something more? One of the problems is you can't just sit outside the base and wait for people to drive by and try to question them. For starters, most employees are flown in and out of the base from a single unmarked airplane that takes off and lands from Las Vegas's McCarran's International Airfield each day. Further, even the men and women who work there are not privy to everything that goes on at Area 51. Some employees have said if something was being tested on the runway, which their group was not a part of, they would be herded into the cafeteria like cattle. Black opaque curtains would go around the windows, and they would basically just have to sit there until the test was over. But to Lazar's credit, he has shown multiple pay stubs and ID badges that show that he probably did work at Area 51 for a time. So basically, that's the mystery of this secret base today. You can now see it on Google Earth. The government has finally admitted that it's there, but that certainly does not mean it's obsolete. Within the last few years, they have just built the biggest runway on Earth at Groom Lake, and they've added more hangars. And yet some think the really classified testing has been moved to what they dub Area 52, which is more commonly known as the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. So that's the mystery of Area 51. Okay, let's get to some six-kind encounters. Now, these can be a little bit scary. This is if an encounter with a UFO causes injury or death. Luckily for humans, this is very, very rare, but we're going to see cows are not quite so lucky. The one case we want to talk about involving a human was the tragic death of this Kentucky Air National Guard pilot named Thomas Mantell. Here was his story. In 1948, a UFO was picked up from multiple radar stations over the skies of Kentucky. Mantell and at least two other pilots were scrambled in their P-51 Mustangs to intercept it and identify it. Despite looking young, Mantell had a great deal of experience with over 2,000 hours in the air, and he was a very well-respected pilot. The UFO, as it was being pursued, began to climb at great speeds to where it was really pushing the altitude limits of the P-51. So his two wingmen peeled off, but Mantell continued to pursue the UFO. One of the final reports he sent back to the ground station was that it was metallic and it was of tremendous size. And then they didn't hear from Mantell again. And then a few hours later, they found the wreckage of his P-51 Mustang. So now the military had to respond because they had a pilot that was dead from this encounter. So they initially claimed that Mantell was chasing the planet Venus, but there were some big problems with that story. Number one, it was still daytime, so Venus wasn't visible. Number two, even if it was dark, Venus was not in the direction that Mantell and the other Mustangs were actually flying. So it was clearly a poor cover story. What's fascinating about this case, though, is when they found the wreckage, for some reason, Mantell's airplane had been able to stay aloft at least a good hour longer than the fuel supply of the P-51 dictated. Further, the wreckage did not look consistent with that of a high altitude free fall and crash. There was minor damage to the airplane. Those on the scene reported it almost looked like the Mustang was held a short distance above the ground and then dropped. The reason Mantell was tragically killed wasn't the impact itself, but it was because his shoulder restraints had failed and snapped, causing the pilot to hit his head off the glass canopy of the cockpit. This case is very significant because prior to this, the government and mainstream scientists were fairly open about the possibility of UFOs with the public. But after this case, it's like a veil of secrecy covered UFOs and the government from that point forward, and it's been maintained ever since. So let's take a break right now, and let's do one or two more questions as I stop sharing the screen here. Okay, so feel free to pause this video at any time. Question number 24. This high security airbase in Nevada is a conspiracy hotspot. Is it just a home for testing of conventional experimental aircraft, or is there genuine reverse engineering of extraterrestrial technology taking place here? Question number 24. Question 25. The United States' public handling of the UFO matter changed drastically when this Kentucky Air National Guard pilot died during a potential close encounter of the sixth kind in 1948. Question 25. Okay, so I had mentioned that humans have been fairly safe. Unfortunately, farm animals, in particular cows, have not been so lucky. There's another rather unsettling phenomenon that's been going on since 1967, and is that of suspicious animal killings. So officially, these are real. The FBI has actually launched 2 separate investigations into them, because not only are they upsetting, but every time it happens, it costs ranchers out there a couple $1,000s when they're losing heads of cattle. The first case actually did not involve a cow, but it was actually a farmer's horse named Lady, who was with her foal out in the middle of the pasture right during the middle of the day. And when the farmer returned a few minutes later to check, Lady was dead under some very mysterious circumstances. So over the past 60 years, there's been a number of explanations given for these so-called cattle mutilations. Some people think it's the work of cults or even some very, very ill-intentioned pranksters. But over the past 60 years, not a single person has ever been caught doing one of these things. And they have some very odd phenomena about them that cannot be explained. And you're going to see some of them are actually very similar to crop circles. So number two, if this was really the work of humans or even of predators, footprints are never found around one of the dead animals, even when the carcass is in a muddy area. Often the animals show evidence of being dropped from a great height. If they're dropped into a muddy field, they're partially sunk down into the field. Number four, like crop circles, they don't always happen at night. Some happen right in the middle of the day. And number five, there's been a big debate among scientists. Isn't this just the work of natural bacteria? And scientists have tried to do experiments where they've left bodies of cows that have died from natural causes out on this pasture land, and they've had cameras recording them the whole time to see if they could catch very similar effects from the natural action of bacteria. But one place they have not been able to explain is when scientists look at tissue samples of these animals in these circumstances, around the edges of where there appear to be holes cut in the hide, they see what are called black peppercorns, which basically means something very hot and cauterizing is used to actually cut out some holes in the flesh. There are also weird things missing that are not consistent with predation. The good meat of the cows is always left untouched, but odd things will be missing, like the eyes, the tongues, the ears, the reproductive system, strange things that animals usually wouldn't take, at least not if there is actual good meat of the cow there. Speaking of predators, they seem to avoid the bodies. If it happens in a herd of cattle, the cows move away as if they know something is wrong. It does seem to tie directly with UFOs. Eyewitnesses report UFO sightings before and after the incidents. Because these happen out west, some actually happen on Native American reservations. When they do, the Native Americans simply say it is the work of the Star people and they are to be trusted, and they'll quickly bury the carcass after one is found. And again, there has been pressure from the government to solve these, and the FBI has launched 2 different investigations and still simply ruled that it's unexplained. So we don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It's definitely a creepy aspect of ufology, but just understand there are phenomena happening out there, and they've been happening for decades, and so far there's no real explanation for them. So one case from seventh kind encounters, and again, I don't want to talk about it too much, and there are even some somewhat humorous aspects to this final case. But a close encounter of the seventh kind is the idea of human-alien hybridization. So here, some people believe that other civilizations are not only real, but they show great interest in humans because we're a beautiful species and they want to do everything they can to try to incorporate some of our beauty in whatever their own civilizations lack. Now, what we can say for certain is that humans have manipulated the genes of plants and animals for thousands of years. For example, take corn, which we all enjoy every single summer. Corn might be evidence of the first ever genetic engineering. It started out as nothing more than very thick seed pods on something that grew naturally out west that looked like a weed. But then Native Americans would always keep the ones that were larger and replant them the following year. And then they would keep those offspring that were larger and save those seeds and replant them. So over many generations, that's led to the corn we have today. Here's how good genetic engineering can be. The American chestnut, which was very, very common back in the 50s and 60s, was almost wiped entirely out of the United States due to a terrible blight that still exists today. But the Japanese chestnut, not nearly as large or durable as the American chestnut, actually has a disease resistance to this blight. And so over the past 30 years, horticulturalists have been able to make a hybrid between the two that's 15/16 American chestnut, but 1/16 Japanese chestnut. But that's the one that has the disease resistance. So they've done this with plants. They certainly do this with animals. If any of your families have ever paid top dollar for a purebred dog. And they even are starting to do this now with humans, which has led to a big moral and ethical debate. So if humans do this, is there a chance that more advanced civilizations would as well? So just one case to share with you. This case was little known at the time. This was the supposed abduction of a Brazilian farmer named Antonio Villas Boas. One night, he's driving his tractor out in the field late at night, plowing fields. He sees a UFO in the sky that, to his shock, lands in the farm field in front of him, and it stalls out the engine on his tractor. He tries to get off of his tractor and flee, but he's quickly overcome by some of the members of the ship who take him on board. He's stripped down and then passed through an antiseptic smelling fog that he believes was some type of a disinfectant. He, according to his account, was then presented with a female extraterrestrial whom he found quite beautiful. After a rather awkward encounter with her, she began to leave the room, but looked back at him, allegedly rubbed her chest and pointed to the sky, which Villas Boas took to mean that she would raise their child in the stars. He was then promptly dropped back at his tractor and the UFO left. In his frustration, he reported that he felt like he was used like a good stud horse and then basically dropped. So a lot of people have been skeptical of this account, and they said, what could an uneducated Brazilian farmer ever know about something like this? He had to be making it up. But we don't want to overlook the detail that he was driving a tractor at the time. Very few families in Brazil could actually afford tractors for farming because there was so much poverty. So because Villas Boas had one, that meant that his family ran a very successful, profitable farm. He held to his story throughout his life. He later became a well-respected lawyer, married an Earth woman, and had a family of his own, and he stuck to his death until 1992. Now, what's fascinating is if you look at the year, this is actually 4 years before the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. And news traveled so slowly back then, nobody had heard of the Villas Boas case in South America at the time, but some aspects of the account are remarkably similar. A really fascinating story. Okay, let's have our final two regular questions before I ask you just a couple review questions here. Question number 26. Among the most alarming of evidence in the extraterrestrial debate, the FBI launched 2 separate investigations into the suspicious killings of these animals, simply concluding that many were unexplained. Question 26. And question 27. The alleged abduction of this Brazilian farmer bears an uncanny semblance to the Betty and Barney Hill case. Some consider it a close encounter of the 7th kind. Question 27. Okay, I needed 3 more questions to get us to an even 10. So our last 3 are review questions. I think they're fairly easy, but if you need to, you can pause the video at any time to find the answers in the notes or in my lecture. Question 28. Astronomers are finding thousands of blank planets, or planets found beyond our solar system. Even mainstream astronomers now believe some may have life. So what is the term for a planet outside or beyond our solar system? Question number 28. Question 29. Popularized by researchers Zachariah Sitchin and Eric von Däniken, this theory proposes that not only are extraterrestrials real, but they have been visiting Earth for thousands of years. Question 29. And finally, question 30. Ranked from 1st to 7th, these levels are used by organizations like MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, to classify UFO reports of modern times. Question number 30. All right, I hope you've enjoyed these lectures, and I am sorry that they've taken so long. I think some of the counts are really, really incredible, so I just wanted to share most of the key details with you. So I hope you'd enjoyed this, and as always, find your own truth, find your own beliefs, examine all aspects of the accounts, and then don't just listen to what people like me say, decide on your own. I hope you've really enjoyed these lectures, Academic Astronomy. For the last time here, this is Mr. Krug. Peace out.